In 1378, two men broke into Westminster Abbey in London, dragged a terrified merchant named Richard Shackle out from where he was hiding, and murdered him right there on the altar steps. His blood pooled on the consecrated stone. The killers fled before they could be caught. The king demanded justice. The church demanded something else entirely. The abbey was shut down for 4 months, the altar desecrated by murder had to be reconsecrated, and nobody talked about punishing the killers because everyone was too focused on punishing the men who had violated sanctuary. You see, Shackle had been taking refuge in the abbey under church protection. He was safe there, legally untouchable, no matter what crimes he'd committed. And his murderers hadn't just killed a man. They'd committed a far worse crime, they'd violated the sacred right of sanctuary. For over 1,000 years, churches across medieval Europe offered absolute legal protection to anyone who made it through their doors: murderers, rapists, thieves, traitors, anyone. If you could reach the church, you were safe. The king's men couldn't touch you. Local authorities couldn't arrest you. You were under God's protection, and God's law superseded human law. If you want to understand how medieval society balanced justice with mercy, how the church's power actually worked in practice, and why this system that seems insane by modern standards actually made a weird kind of sense, hit that subscribe button and like this video, because the story of medieval sanctuary reveals how radically different ideas about crime, punishment, and authority used to be. Sanctuary, also called church sanctuary or right of asylum, was the legal principle that certain sacred spaces, primarily churches, could offer protection from secular legal prosecution. If you committed a crime and made it to a church before being captured, you could claim sanctuary. As long as you stayed within the church's boundaries, you could not be forcibly removed by law enforcement. This wasn't a folk custom or unofficial practice. It was codified law, recognized by both church and state authorities across medieval Europe. The origins go back to ancient times. Greek and Roman temples offered asylum to fugitives. Early Christianity adopted and expanded this practice. By the 4th century, Christian churches in the Roman Empire were recognized as offering sanctuary. The practice grew throughout the early medieval period and became formalized in both canon law, the church's legal system, and secular law codes across Europe. In England, sanctuary rights were clearly established by the 7th century. King Ethelbert of Kent's law code from around 600 AD recognized church sanctuary. By the Norman conquest in 1066, sanctuary was a well-established legal right. Every church offered at least basic sanctuary. Certain churches and monasteries offered enhanced sanctuary with special privileges. Westminster Abbey, Durham Cathedral, Beverley Minster, and about 20 other sites in England offered permanent sanctuary where a fugitive could potentially stay indefinitely. The rules varied by location and period, but the basic framework was consistent. If you committed a crime and fled to a church, you had to get inside the church proper. Just being in the churchyard wasn't always enough, though some churches recognized their entire precinct as sanctuary space. Once inside, you would typically grab hold of a specific object, often the altar, a sanctuary ring mounted on the church door, or a designated sanctuary chair. This physical act of claiming sanctuary was important. You weren't just hiding in a church. You were formally invoking a legal protection. You would then declare to the priest or whoever was present that you were claiming sanctuary. The church had an obligation to protect you from that moment forward. Anyone who tried to remove you by force was committing sacrilege, a serious crime in its own right. Guards or pursuers who violated sanctuary could be excommunicated, meaning expelled from the church and denied salvation. This was not a minor punishment in medieval society. Excommunication was spiritual death. The local authorities would be notified. A coroner or other official would come to the church to record your claim. You would be required to confess your crime to the coroner. This confession couldn't be used against you in trial if you left sanctuary, but it created an official record. The coroner would also arrange for the church to be provisioned, because you might be there a while. Here's where it gets interesting. You had options. First, you could stay in sanctuary indefinitely, at least in theory. In practice, churches couldn't support fugitives forever, and staying in a church for years wasn't pleasant. You couldn't leave for any reason. If you stepped outside the sanctuary boundary, even briefly, you lost protection and could be arrested immediately. Guards would often be posted outside waiting for you to make a mistake. Second, you could negotiate. Sometimes the victim's family or the local authorities would agree to a settlement. You might pay compensation, make restitution, or accept a lesser punishment. The church often mediated these negotiations. If an agreement was reached, you could leave sanctuary and face the agreed-upon consequences without risk of harsher punishment. Third, and most commonly, you could abjure the realm. This meant you would confess your crime, surrender any property, and swear an oath to leave England forever. You would be assigned a specific port and given a set number of days to reach it. During this journey, you had to wear distinctive clothing, usually a white robe, and carry a wooden cross, identifying yourself as a sanctuary fugitive. You had to stay on the King's Highway and make steady progress toward the port. If you deviated or took too long, you lost protection and could be executed on sight. Once you reached the designated port, you had to board the first available ship leaving England. If no ship was available, you had to wade into the sea up to your knees every day to demonstrate your willingness to leave. This bizarre requirement was actually enforced. There are records of fugitives standing in the surf for weeks waiting for a ship. If you successfully left England, you could never return. If you came back, you could be executed immediately without trial. Abjuration was permanent exile backed by death penalty. For someone deeply rooted in their community, with family and livelihood tied to a specific place, this was an enormous punishment even if it wasn't death. The system created strange scenarios. Imagine you're a medieval sheriff. Someone has committed murder in your jurisdiction. You know who did it. You know where they are, inside the local church. You can see them through the door. But you can't arrest them. If you try, the church will excommunicate you, the bishop will complain to the king, and you'll be punished for violating sanctuary. So you post guards outside and wait, hoping the fugitive will eventually make a mistake or agree to abjure the realm. From the fugitive's perspective, you're trapped. You're safe from immediate execution, but you're confined to a single building with no freedom of movement. You depend entirely on the church's charity for food and water. You can't work. You can't see your family except through the church door. You can't leave without facing either the justice you fled from or permanent exile from everything you've ever known. The church's position was complex. Theologically, sanctuary was justified by the principle that the church offered a path to redemption. God's mercy superseded human justice. Everyone deserved a chance at repentance, even criminals. By offering sanctuary, the church gave fugitives time to confess, repent, and seek spiritual salvation even if they faced earthly punishment afterward. Practically, sanctuary enhanced church authority. It demonstrated that church law was above secular law. It showed that even kings had to respect church privileges. Every fugitive claiming sanctuary was a visible reminder that the church had powers the state didn't. This was important in an era of constant tension between church and secular authorities over who held ultimate authority. But sanctuary also created serious problems. It frustrated justice. Victims and their families were denied satisfaction. Criminals escaped appropriate punishment. Communities were denied safety. A murderer sitting in the local church for months while everyone knew they did it but couldn't do anything about it was infuriating for many people. The system was also widely abused. Guilty people claimed sanctuary and escaped justice. But innocent people also used sanctuary to avoid unjust prosecution or to escape powerful enemies who were manipulating the legal system. In a medieval justice system that lacked many of the protections we take for granted, sanctuary sometimes provided necessary refuge for people who would otherwise be victims of judicial murder. Records from medieval England show thousands of sanctuary claims. Between 1478 and 1530, the sanctuary at Westminster Abbey alone had over 400 recorded claimants. Most were debtors, surprisingly. Debt was a criminal matter in medieval England, and debtors faced imprisonment. Many fled to sanctuary to avoid debtors' prison and negotiate settlements with creditors from safety. But serious criminals also used sanctuary. Murderers, thieves, rapists, all claimed sanctuary at various times. The records show that murder was a common reason for claiming sanctuary. These weren't all cold-blooded killings. Many were results of fights, disputes, or accidents. Medieval violence was common, and the line between homicide and justifiable killing was often unclear. Sanctuary gave time for emotions to cool and for more nuanced resolutions than immediate execution. Some famous cases illustrate how sanctuary worked in practice. In 1483, Queen Elizabeth Woodville fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her children when her husband King Edward IV died and Richard III seized power. She feared for her son's safety, correctly as it turned out. She stayed in sanctuary for months. Richard couldn't forcibly remove her or the princes without committing sacrilege. Eventually, she was persuaded to let the princes leave sanctuary, and they disappeared into the Tower of London, presumably murdered. But while they were in sanctuary, they were legally untouchable. Thomas Becket, before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, dealt with numerous sanctuary cases as Royal Chancellor. He generally supported sanctuary rights, which put him at odds with King Henry II. Their conflict over church versus state authority, which extended to sanctuary among many other issues, eventually led to Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral was the ultimate sanctuary violation, and it created a political crisis that weakened Henry's authority for years. In 1519, a group of apprentices rioted in London on what became known as Evil May Day. They attacked foreign merchants and destroyed property. Hundreds were arrested. Many faced execution. Several rioters fled to various churches and claimed sanctuary. The king wanted them executed as an example, but the churches protected them. Eventually, the church negotiated a settlement where most of the sanctuary claimants were pardoned in exchange for public penance. Sanctuary had saved their lives and given time for political circumstances to change. The physical experience of sanctuary varied. Some churches were relatively comfortable. Westminster Abbey had designated sanctuary chambers where fugitives could sleep. Food was provided by the church or by the fugitive's family. Durham Cathedral was known for treating sanctuary claimants well, with decent accommodations and provisions. Other churches were less hospitable. Small parish churches might have no provisions at all. The fugitive would sleep on the stone floor, depend on charity for food, and live in genuine misery. The church had an obligation to provide basic protection but not necessarily comfort. Fugitives in sanctuary couldn't just live normally inside the church. They couldn't interfere with church services or activities. They had to stay out of the way. They were expected to participate in prayers and services. Some churches required sanctuary claimants to help with church maintenance or other tasks. It was refuge, not vacation. The boundaries of sanctuary could be contentious. If a church claimed its entire precinct as sanctuary, that might include outbuildings, gardens, or even substantial areas around the church. Durham Cathedral's sanctuary included a significant portion of the town. Westminster Abbey's sanctuary extended throughout the Abbey precinct. This created odd situations where sanctuary fugitives could move around relatively freely within a defined area but faced arrest the moment they crossed an invisible boundary line. Secular authorities constantly tested these boundaries. They would build up forces just outside sanctuary boundaries. They would try to lure fugitives out through tricks or force them out through cutting off supplies. The church would protest these violations, and disputes would escalate to bishops and sometimes to the king himself. Some fugitives became long-term sanctuary residents. There are records of people staying in sanctuary for years. They would develop routines, relationships with the church community, even conduct business through intermediaries. But they were always trapped, always one mistake away from arrest or execution. The decline of sanctuary began in the 15th century and accelerated in the 16th. Secular authorities, particularly monarchs seeking to centralize power, found sanctuary increasingly inconvenient. It undermined royal justice and created pockets of legal immunity that frustrated law enforcement. Henry VIII was particularly hostile to sanctuary. He saw it as limiting royal authority. In 1540, Parliament passed a law restricting sanctuary. Certain serious crimes, including murder, rape, burglary, robbery, and arson, were no longer sanctuaryable. If you committed one of these crimes, churches couldn't protect you. This was a major reduction in sanctuary rights. The remaining sanctuary privileges were further limited over the following decades. By 1623, sanctuary was effectively abolished in England. James I signed legislation that eliminated the legal protection sanctuary had offered. Churches could still offer physical refuge in the sense that they could hide people, but there was no legal obligation for authorities to respect that refuge. If police wanted to enter a church and arrest someone, they could do so without committing a crime. The Protestant Reformation contributed to sanctuary's decline. Protestant theology emphasized individual relationship with God and de-emphasized church institutional authority. The idea that church buildings had special sacred powers that superseded secular law fit uncomfortably with Protestant thinking. Catholic countries maintained sanctuary longer, but even there it gradually weakened. By the 18th century, sanctuary was effectively dead throughout Europe. It persisted in a few isolated locations and in limited forms, but the medieval system where any criminal could claim church protection and force authorities to negotiate was over. Modern echoes of sanctuary exist but in very different forms. Some countries recognize diplomatic asylum, where embassies can protect fugitives from host nation authorities. This is closest to medieval sanctuary in principle, a bounded space where normal law doesn't fully apply. But diplomatic asylum is limited to political cases and is much more restricted than medieval church sanctuary. The sanctuary movement in the 1980s United States saw churches sheltering Central American refugees facing deportation. Churches offered physical refuge and moral support, arguing that unjust immigration policies shouldn't be enforced. This was symbolic more than legal. Churches had no legal authority to prevent arrests, and police could enter churches and arrest refugees if they chose. Most of the time they chose not to for political reasons, not legal ones. Medieval sanctuary seems bizarre to modern sensibilities. Why should criminals escape justice just by reaching a church? Why should church law override civil law? Why should fugitives be allowed to negotiate from a position of protected safety? But medieval people would find our system equally strange. We rely entirely on state authority to administer justice. We have no higher authority to appeal to, no space outside state control. If the state is unjust or corrupt, we have limited options. Medieval sanctuary provided a check on state power. It created space for negotiation, mercy, and second chances. It recognized that justice isn't simple and that sometimes the technicalities of law need to bend to human circumstances. Sanctuary also reflected different ideas about crime and punishment. We tend to see crimes as offenses against the state that require state punishment. Medieval people saw many crimes as offenses against individuals or communities that could be resolved through compensation, reconciliation, or exile. Sanctuary created time and space for those alternative resolutions. The system wasn't perfect. It absolutely let guilty people escape proper accountability. It frustrated victims seeking justice. It created perverse incentives where criminals could commit crimes knowing they had an escape route. But it also saved innocent people from unjust prosecution, gave time for situations to de-escalate, and provided checks on secular authority that could otherwise be tyrannical. Medieval sanctuary was a 1,000-year experiment in balancing justice, mercy, and power. It gave churches authority over secular matters. It created spaces outside state control. It recognized that sometimes justice requires flexibility and second chances. And it demonstrated that in medieval society, no power was absolute. Not the king. Not the law. Not even the church itself could claim total authority because each was balanced against the others. The Richard Shackle case we started with illustrates the competing values. Shackle had fled to Westminster Abbey seeking protection. His killers violated sanctuary to murder him. From a pure justice perspective, Shackle may have deserved punishment for whatever he did. His killers arguably carried out justice he'd been evading. But medieval society didn't see it that way. The violation of sanctuary was worse than whatever Shackle had done because it undermined the entire system of checks and balances. It said that violence could override law, that sacred spaces weren't protected, that church authority meant nothing. The killers were never caught, but the violation was taken seriously. The abbey was shut down for months. Every altar had to be reconsecrated. The space had been polluted by violence and needed ritual purification. This wasn't just symbolic. It demonstrated that sanctuary violations had real consequences even if the specific violators escaped. For over 1,000 years, if you could make it to a church, you had a chance. Not a guarantee of freedom, but a chance to negotiate, to repent, to find a third way between execution and escape. The church doors were open to everyone, saints and sinners alike. God's mercy, as represented by the church, was available even to those who least deserved it. That's what medieval sanctuary meant. And when it ended, something was lost. Not just a legal technicality, but an acknowledgement that justice isn't simple, that mercy has value, and that power needs limits. We have different systems now, systems that in many ways work better. But sometimes, when the state seems overwhelming and alternatives feel impossible, you can understand why medieval people might run for the church doors, hoping that somewhere, somehow, there was a power that said no, this person is under our protection now.